So this video is going to be kind of going over the basics of breeding Loricaria's Pleco species. Um, I really like Plecos. I've been breeding them for quite a while, a little bit more than a decade now, actually. Um, they're really cool animals. If you don't know what I'm talking about, I will put a picture up right here. Um, And everyone knows, anyone who's kept an aquarium before knows what a common pleco is. You get them this big, they're really cute. They get this big, then you get rid of them. But the thing is that they get even bigger than that. Common plecos are actually not a very appropriate species for most tanks. Um, in this, I'm going to be talking about breeding various plecos, and I will show a broad range of plecos. But a little bit about my experience breeding them. Um, I started breeding them when I was about 13 years old, which means I actually almost have 15 years of experience at this point. Um, when I started, I was breeding some of the more commonly available species. Your bristlenose plecos, your other smaller species like rubber lips, otocinclus. Uh, let's see. That was really most of what I was breeding when I was in high school. When I graduated high school, I branched out into other species. I've now bred Farlowella twig cats, um, red lizard twig cats, Medusa plecos, vampire plecos, um, a few different panax species, including blue and green phantoms. Um, let's see. Several other species that I can't really think of off the top of my head. But there's a lot of species out there, and I've kept many species too, but not successfully bred them, and that may have to do with their size or specific requirements that I could not meet. Like zebra plecos, I tried unsuccessfully to breed for a while. Um, so, without any further commentary, let's get started. Riggs is going to be keeping me company right there in the background until he decides to move. Um, so yeah, the first chapter of this video is going to be before you start, and that's before you buy your animals, before you start breeding them, any of that stuff. It's your kind of first things first sort of thing. Um, First thing to do is pick a species, and the way to do that is to find one you like. And there's a few ways to do this. One is to go to a place like planetcatfish.com. They have a catalog. I am sorry for the pun, but that's what they call it. And in there you can select animals by family, and you'll want to go to the Loricaria family. And there are hundreds of species recognized. And the thing with Loricarias is that right now, they are discovering species so swiftly that they cannot give them scientific names fast enough. So they are actually giving them what are called L numbers. So it'll be L followed by 1 to 3 digits. Excuse me, I burped. But so you wanna find one that you like, and there's all different kinds of colors: stripes, splotches, spots, polka dots. Completely monochromatic. So things like blue and green phantom plecos. Are completely monochromatic. There's some with blue eyes, there's some with red eyes, there's some with eyes that you can't even distinguish the color of. So find one that you like. That's the first step. The next step is seeing if they are available regularly in the hobby. A lot of these animals are not, and their prices, when they are available, will show that they'll usually be $30 plus. There are some Plecostomus that, as a species, will generally cost more than $100, $200, $300 per individual. So, in general, those are not good beginner animals, or good starting species for a potential breeder. Probably some of the more common species that people start with are animals like the bristlenose plecos, the rubber-lip plecos, otocinclus, which aren't necessarily a loricaria, but they are very closely related. They're really cool, but they only get, a couple inches. They're little guys. So pick one that you like and see if it's readily available. Um, Next step is to look at supply and demand. This kind of ties in with the first step. Um, but if an animal is routinely available, regularly available, that's probably a good one to start with. The only downside to that is that it may be hard to find homes for all your little babies if you are successful with this. So you need to think about that. Um, that's the next step, is making sure that you have a place to take, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 plus fry once they reach an appropriate size to sell them, which depends on the species, of course. Um, but you need to look into that before you decide that that's a good species. Just because a species is really easy to find, like a common pleco, doesn't mean that if you breed them, you're going to find homes for them, because your local fish shop may not want 50 little common plecs. They may not want 50 little bristlenose plecs because they may be able to get them cheaper somewhere else. Which leads into the second part of the second list here: wholesale retail prices. If you go into a local fish shop and you say, "Hey, I've got 50 baby bristlenose plecos. They aren't any special color morph. They're just, little brown bristlenoses. What will you give me for them?" You can expect that you're going to get half or less than half of the retail value. So, a common bristlenose will probably sell for about $5 to $10, depending on size. You may get $3 a piece, or $2 a piece, or even $1 a piece, depending on if they have them routinely available, and if they actually want them. They may actually refuse them. They may say, "No, we don't need those. We can get them cheaper somewhere else," or "No, we've got as many bristlenoses as we can handle right now." You have to think about that. You need to find a home before you start breeding, because once you have 50 babies, that's not the time to start looking, because now you have 6 tanks full, and no one wants any of your plecos. So that's a serious problem. So look into that before you buy your breeder pair. Um, Number 3 is resources. There are a lot of resources that go into breeding, and you need to look at all of them before you start breeding. First and foremost is time. Breeding plex takes time, and if you don't have time, you have 2 jobs, 3 jobs, you have a job and 16 kids, whatever you got going on. Time is very important. You need time for cleaning the tank. When you're breeding plecos, you're going to be doing 20% water changes at least once a week. Depending on how many plecos you have, you may be doing it more than that. You may be doing it twice a week. Besides that, you need time for feeding. When you are conditioning your animals, you need to get them to breeding size and maintain breeding size, which means that you are going to be feeding twice a day for your adults. Babies, you will feed twice to 3 times a day, sometimes more. So think about that. That's a big investment of time into breeding these animals, and if you have a very busy job, or other commitments, you may not have the time to invest in this. Number 2 is money. Some of these animals are quite expensive. Getting a breeding pair can be very expensive, especially if you're looking into something like zebra plecos. They are very expensive because there's very high demand and not many people have successfully bred them. When you get into more obscure species, they can be more expensive. Besides that, you need to put money into food. You need to put money into running your filters, your pumps, your lights, all of that stuff. Very important. Just very general, broad overview. All of that stuff costs money. So if you don't have the money to invest in that, then maybe it's not the appropriate time to start breeding plecos for you. Space. So some of these animals get large. Like your royal plecos can get to 22, 24 inches. There's some other species out there like Queen Arabesque that can get the size of a baseball bat. You're talking about a 36-inch plus animal. As far as I know, no one has successfully bred those, probably because they're just so massive. There are, smaller species, and that's kind of what I'm going to focus on with this, just because that's what most people are going to start with. But that's something to keep in mind. These animals do take up a lot of space. Even if you're breeding a small species, something that can be kept in a 10-gallon or a 20 long, the ideal way to do it is to set up multiple tanks so you can spawn your fry, Once your fry start hatching, you can move them into another tank. Or before, depending on which method you want. I prefer to let the male brood the eggs, but we'll get into that later. And it's not a bad idea to, as they grow, either move them up into tanks or to put different sets of fry in different tanks, because they will all hatch at different times. You're not going to have one brood one week and then the next brood the next week hatch at the same time if you have multiple pairings going on. Again, more about that later. So multiple tanks and then tank size are both of the things that I talked about there. Next is effort. There's going to be quite a bit of effort into breeding these animals. This is not limited to just basic tank maintenance and stuff. This is extracurricular activity to keeping a tropical tank. So we're talking about stuff like adjusting temperature, adjusting photo period, making a food paste for your babies, which I will talk about when we get to that particular section. But that's all stuff that you need to work into your schedule, and it's going to take effort and time to do that. You need to observe your babies, you need to observe your adults, make sure that they're the appropriate, make sure your adults are breeding size, make sure that everything that's happening is appropriate, make sure that your male isn't starving to death because he's going from broodstock to broodstock without any rest period in between. All of that stuff is very important to watch, and that is not only time, but it is effort on your part to ensure that you get your maximum viability out of your breeding. All right, so after you've done all of that, you've assessed that you have the time, energy, and resources to invest into breeding. You've selected your species. You've made sure that you have a place for your species or for your babies to go once they are ready to leave. After you have done all of that, the next thing to do is research. So you want to do a lot of research before you start breeding, and this is before you buy your animals too. Always, 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 whether it's fish, whether it's reptiles, whether it's amphibians, whether it's a dog, whether it's a cat, I don't know where he is right now, but always research before you buy an animal or before you commit to caring for an animal. Very, very, very important. You can learn some stuff on the fly, but fish keeping and reptile keeping in general is much less forgiving than, say, a dog or a cat or another mammal, really. Always do your research, and you need to research a lot of stuff. First and foremost, I would research the natural history of the animal, where they come from, what water temperatures run there, what other water quality parameters are there. Stuff like that is very important. You want to look at, one thing to look at is online breeding accounts, if you can find them. Unless you're looking for something new and challenging that has not been bred in captivity yet, I would look into a place like fishbase.com or again planetcatfish.com to look into their natural history, when their breeding period is, water quality preferences, all of that stuff. That stuff is generally readily available with some of the more common species. When you get into rarer species, it's a little bit more guesswork, but that's a great starting point. It's a great place to start from. Check out their natural history. The next thing you can do is you can look at breeding accounts online. Anything online, take with a grain of salt, because some people online lie. I have seen breeding accounts for species that I know the person did not breed them themselves, because the way that they were keeping them and the things they were doing are counterproductive to the breeding process for those species. I'm not going to name names or specifics or anything like that, but it can happen. So anything you see online, take with a grain of salt. If you read 5 different accounts from 5 different people and there are certain things that correlate in those, I'd say it'd be safe to assume that that is how that animal is bred, or those things are contributing factors to how that animal is bred. Besides that, if you see something that's like way out there, I would be very cautious about including that in my breeding regimen for my animals. Let's see, next is max size. Like I was talking about previously, look at the max size of your animal. If you want to breed like royal plecos, think about that, because those animals are huge, or Queen Arabesque, or Galaxy plecos, or red cactus plecos. These animals are huge, and the problem with that is that you need a huge tank, and realistically, you should be keeping those animals alone with a single pair or a single breeding group are the only animals in that tank, so you don't have any pressures or stresses, additional stresses on those animals. It gives them the optimal breeding opportunity. And the downside to that is that plecos are not extremely active. So you may have what looks like an empty tank, and if you have a 300-gallon tank for your breeding group of galaxy plecos, then it's going to look like an empty tank most of the time. So that's something to keep in mind. Your friends and family may not like it. Your roommate may not like it that you have a giant empty tank. A giant tank that looks empty most of the time because the animals in it are always hiding or they're very sedentary. Again, look at that. And then besides that, look at the natural history of the animal in comparison to tank size. So Panac species or Panac species of pleco have very, very large, rough teeth. I'll show a picture of their teeth, and they're huge. You cannot keep those animals in an acrylic tank. So if you get a 300-gallon acrylic tank because you want to breed royal plecos, that tank is going to get destroyed. They are going to chew the walls until it's just so fuzzy that you can't see inside, unless you want to pull them out once a month to buffer the entire tank, which is not conducive to breeding behaviors and activities. So think about that. Next is diet. Some of these animals are very specific in their diets. Things like vampire plecos are primarily carnivorous. They don't really eat a whole lot of plant material. Most other species eat at least a little bit of plant material. Most of them will accept protein-rich foods. Some will completely refuse them. In my experience, they'll all eat at least a little bit, and it should be included in the diet to help them gain weight, to get them to breeding size. So think about that. One thing specifically, Panac species need to have driftwood as part of their diet. So you need to have driftwood in the tank. The problem with that is that driftwood, even if you soak it previously and even if you cook it previously, has a tendency towards leaching tannins into the water, which one, lowers pH, and two, makes your water look like coffee. I really like the kind of brownish look. I feel like it gives it a little bit more of a natural appeal. I like the way it looks personally. A lot of people don't. A lot of people like that pristine glass clear water that they for whatever reason, because you can see the fish a little better and it doesn't tinge the coloration of the fish or anything like that. I really don't care. I kind of like the way it looks, like I said. So that's something to keep in mind if you want to do a Panac species. Even if you soak the driftwood beforehand, there is a chance it's going to stain your water at least a little bit. So keep that in mind. Last thing to look into is wild behaviors and preferences. So when you are looking into your species, you want to observe a few things. Do they like sluggish water? Do they like fast water? Do they like low pH, high pH? Do they like sand? Do they like gravel? All of these things are very, very important, because if your species that you select has to have sand to breed, then if you put it on gravel, it's not going to breed for you. If the species that you select prefers to breed, spawn on broadleaf plants, and you don't have any broadleaf plants available, it's probably not going to breed for you. If the species breeds in caves and you have no caves available, it's probably not going to breed for you. If the species likes fast-flowing water, prefers fast-flowing water, and you do not supply that, it's probably not going to breed for you. You need to replicate the natural environment as closely as possible, or well within means, or at least have a simulation of the things that they need or prefer to breed. If you do not do that, chances are you will not be successful. There are exceptions, of course. There are some species of plecos that you could probably throw in a 5-gallon bucket without any filtration and leave them for a month, and come back like I said, at the end of that month, and you'll have 3 or 4 spawnings. If you want optimal breeding and optimal young from each breeding, then you want to simulate the natural environment as much as you can. Alright, so Research, again, research is very, very important for all species, for all of the reasons that I said, and those are all aspects. Don't limit yourself to just those aspects. Do as much research as possible. That's a good general overview, though. Next, getting started. So, first things first, you want to set up your tank. Most of your small Pleco species, anything up to 4, maybe even 5 inches, you could conceivably do an 8-inch species in a 20 long. That's really pushing it, though. Realistically, a 4 or 5-inch species is what I would do for a 20 long gallon tank. And a 20 long is a great place to start for most of your beginner species like bristle noses, rubber lips, things like that. So, first things first, get your 20 long. Decide what you want for filtration, and filtration will be kind of dependent on your species. If you have a species that prefers sluggish water, a sponge filter is a great way to go. Sponge filters are biological and physical in their nature, and they are very sluggish. It doesn't really create any kind of flow in the tank. If you don't like that, if you want a little bit of flow, a over-the-side cartridge filter is a decent thing to do. I'm not a huge fan of the cartridge filters. I actually prefer canisters. They don't make canisters that are appropriate for a 20-gallon tank. Regardless, if you choose a species that prefers high, fast-flowing water, you may want to add a power head, at least a small one. If they like that high flow, then that's something to consider. Ornaments. Cage ornaments are dependent on species. Again, for animals like bristlenose plecos, using chunks of PVC, because they like to breed in caves, chunks of PVC or even cichlid caves, they make specialized cichlid caves, those are appropriate for breeding those animals. Also, you can do things like leaning pieces of slate against the side of the tank, stuff like that. PVC doesn't look pretty, doesn't look very natural. It is functional, though. I've also done PVC for other cave breeding species like, let's see, red lizard cats, and twig cats of various species, the Farlowella genus animals. So consider all of that. If your species likes to breed out in the open or in sand, in depressions in the sand, then you need to have sand as your substrate. If they are cave dwellers, you can usually get away with gravel. I lean a little bit more towards the sand just because I like the way it looks. Gives it more of a natural look, or at least a stereotypically natural look. And then also with sand, you can do, if you're, off-season breeding or something like that, or you decide to retire your breeders, you can add in cool animals like banjo cats. One of my favorite species, and they need sand because they love to bury themselves, and if they can't bury themselves, then they end up dying. Anyway, got off on a tangent there. All right, so next is filtration, or cycling, excuse me. We talked about filtration already. So cycle the tank. This generally takes at least 14 days for a tropical tank, depending on the temperature, and granted, since you're breeding plecos, that's going to be at least 75 degrees up to 80 for some species, depending. So that's something to keep in mind. You cannot just drop fish in right away. You can do a fish in cycle, but for plecos this can be extremely stressful. It's something to consider. Ideally, you would add a bacterial culture to it, which helps speed up the process a little bit, but you need to feed that bacterial culture. You can't just dump the bacteria in. So keep that in mind. You're looking at least 14 days for a cycling. I have done a cycling in as little as 7 days, but I added cultured rock and I added cultured driftwood to that system, and that helped boost it a little bit. That helped speed it up. So there are things you can do to boost your cycle, but expect at least 14 days to get that cycle ready. Next is introducing the fish to the tank. I would strongly recommend not only doing a temperature acclimation, so your classic, stick the bag in the top of the water, but I would also recommend doing a water quality or a drip acclimation as well. And there's a variety of ways to do this. I may do a video on it later, just because there's so many different ways to do it. But what you want to do is you want to equalize the water quality in the bag and in your tank. So I would almost guarantee that the water quality is not going to be the exact same if you take water from the local fish shop and compare it to your water, there's going to be differences of some sort. Or not least of all would be ammonia just in the bag from the fish being really stressed from transport. As they breathe, they actually release ammonia into the water, and since the bag has no filtration, that ammonia rests in the water, and as soon as it gets exposed to oxygen, it spikes it. And if it's only 10 minutes down to the local fish shop and back, that's not a big deal. If it's like me and my local fish shop is 2.5 hours that way, that's a big problem. And especially since I don't always come directly home once I buy fish, which is not the ideal way to do it, but in some in some instances that is what happens. So I need to be more careful with that, and that's something that I work on continually to try and get to be more efficient. But that's something to keep in mind. If you're a long way from your local fish shop, it may be worth it to do a much slower drip acclimation. So keep that in mind. And when you first introduce your fish, don't expect them to breed right off the bat. Sometimes it does happen, and it's that stress from moving from one tank where they've been for a while to another. If the female is receptive and she's ovulating, sometimes they will spawn right away. A lot of the times I've noticed that these initial spawns, these stress-related spawns, are not all that successful. In fact, a lot of the time it seems like the eggs are not properly fertilized or not in the proper level of development to become fertilized even. So they may lay eggs right off the bat, but I wouldn't, treat them like you would any other batch of eggs, but I wouldn't be too hopeful. I wouldn't be holding my breath thinking that these animals or these eggs are going to be extremely viable. You may not have a very high success rate with them. Next thing to do is start conditioning your fish. Once they start feeding regularly, which may take a couple days, if you move them, a lot of the times you get they're kind of stressed out and stuff. They don't want to eat for the first day, first 2 days. That's pretty normal. Once you get them started eating, then I would start conditioning them for breeding, and that means daily to 2 times daily feedings, depending on species and depending on size. If your animals are a ways off from breeding, like you get bristlenose plecos that are like 1.5 inches long, you are at least a year off, if not 2 years off from breeding those animals. So it's not necessarily conditioning so much as just feeding them so they grow. And you don't want to gut load them, or at least not a lot. You want to feed them, but you want to feed them an appropriate amount. If you power feed them and gut load them, then what happens is they grow really, really rapidly, but it causes organ damage. It causes stuff like fatty liver disease and other things like that. You can say, oh, I grew my bristlenose plecos from 1 inch to 4 inches in 8 months. But those animals generally live much, much shorter lives, and in fact their fecundity can suffer because of that. So that's something to keep in mind. But say you get adult animals, or at least young adult animals. They are sexually mature, they are ready for breeding. So start cycling them. Feed them at least twice a day. Sometimes you can get away with 3 feedings a day, but it would be much, much smaller feedings. It wouldn't be full on, like until they stop eating feedings. And you want them both to be really, always have nice full bellies, and have really good, healthy looking finnage, bright, clear eyes, no tattered fins, stuff like that. You want them to be in peak physical condition. You want to look at that fish and say, yeah, that's a really healthy fish. If you look at them and you say, yes, this fish is ready, then chances are they are ready. So with a lot of Pleco species, you can look at them from the top and you can actually differentiate male from female that way. The females will actually have a more rounded body in the upper torso-stomach area, or the equivalent on a fish of what that would be. And the males will be more slender looking. There are, of course, other ways to distinguish certain species. In some species, the males have more oodontodes, kind of looks like mutton chops. Stuff like red lizard catfish, males, females. Males have more oodontos. They'll also have them on the ridge of the pectoral fin. A lot of the times the males will have more. In male bristlenoses, or in bristlenoses, males often will have much, much more and much, much more complex bristles all over their face. So those are other ways to observe when your animals are sexually mature. All right. Next is actual breeding. So chances are you will not see the animals actually breeding. You will not see them spawning. But you will see the behaviors that lead up to it. You'll see stuff like the male trying to herd the female into a cave or into an area that he's prepared, that he's cleaned off for her to breed on. You'll see the male kind of rubbing up against the female sometimes, things like that. Um, just every day, once your animals are, breeding size and healthy weight, you want to observe them and make sure that, or not make sure, but observe those behaviors and take note when you see those behaviors. It's not a bad idea to keep a journal for that tank and say, oh, today I noticed that the male was flashing his fins at the female. Today I noticed that the male was trying to guide the female into a breeding cave. Things like that. Always observe those. It doesn't hurt to document them. Always, and like I said before, conditioning, you want to observe the size and weight of the animals. If your male is ready to breed and your female isn't quite ready to breed, he may still harass her, and you may have to separate them. And vice versa. Well, actually, vice versa doesn't happen all that often. It's usually up to the male to kind of guide the female. Although I have seen females kind of nudging against the males when they were ready and the males weren't quite ready, being kind of like, "Oh, hey, it's time to go," and the male usually will indulge the female, but often it kind of seems almost reluctantly so if the male's underweight or not quite ready. So observe their size and weight. You may have to separate them if one or the other isn't ready and the other one's being really pushy about it. Keep that in mind. All right, next is to monitor your water quality. Since you are going to be feeding more, that means that your water quality may suffer if you are not careful. You want to do water quality at least once a week, if not twice a week, if not every other day, and make sure that your nitrites, nitrates, and ammonia are staying low. With all that extra food, the fish are going to be pooping more. They're going to be just extruding waste more, which means that you may have to do more water changes. Like I said before, you may go up to 2 water changes a week, 20% water changes a week. If you want those babies, that may have to happen. Besides that, you also want to watch your pH, you want to watch your hardness, all that stuff. If you're breeding a blackwater species that specifically needs really, really low pH and super soft water, you want to keep your eyes on that. You don't want your water to get out of whack, so to speak. I'm not super jive, so bear with me. But yeah, monitor your water quality very closely, just to make sure that your animals are healthy and happy. So, you do all that, the animals breed, you get eggs. Awesome. What do you do now? So, the way I do this is I leave the males to brood the eggs. This takes anywhere from 8 to 20 days, depending on the species, depending on water temperature, depending on the individual, depending on the fecundity, all that stuff. The male generally guards the eggs. There's a few species where the male just leaves the babies off, or leaves the eggs off on his own or on their own. With those species, it doesn't hurt to just pull the eggs out and put them in a separate tank for brooding. Make sure they have water flow over them, so you don't get any fungus, any fuzz on the eggs. When the male does tend the eggs, he takes care of that. He always is going over the eggs and cleaning them off. Generally, if there's any dead eggs, he will eat those. So you want to... Generally, what I do is I leave the male to take care of those, and when the eggs start hatching, I either remove the eggs, or as the babies hatch, I pull them out with an eyedropper that has been gauged out, so it's much, much wider, so you're not crushing the babies as you're pulling them out with the eyedropper. So yeah, as soon as they start hatching, you can either pull the entire batch, or you can pull them out with the eyedropper and put them in a separate tank. But back to the eggs. If you only have one male and several females, so say you are breeding bristlenose and you have one male and 5 females, that ratio is a little bit heavy. It's heavier than I would prefer. If I was doing 5 females, I would do at least 2 males, if not 3 males, just to make sure that they're cycling through, and there's not that much pressure on the males, because since the males are the ones who take care of the young, you need to watch his weight, because they will deny food to watch the young. I have actually seen males waste away, not my males, because I generally keep a closer eye on them than that. But I have seen males waste away because they were so bent on taking care of the young that they denied food. And as soon as they had fully brooded a spawning, another female was already ready to go, and they went right in and bred with that female and spawned with that female, and then started the whole thing over again. So these males are going, 30, 40, 50 days without any food at all, or minimal food, so they can starve themselves to death. Is ultimately what happens. So you need to keep a close eye on that. All right. So now you have babies. Congratulations. We're going to do that because I've been messing with my hair this entire time. All right. So I recommend keeping a separate tank, a 5 to 10 gallon tank. I generally don't put any substrate in the bottom. It's usually just a bare bottom tank so I can watch the babies a little bit closer. I do multiple feedings a day. I would strongly recommend at least 2 feedings a day, if not 3 feedings a day. What I feed is a paste made out of spirulina and agar-agar. I believe it's 2 parts spirulina to 1 part agar-agar mixed with cold water. I spread it as a paste over a flat surface, say a piece of slate or the lid of a Tupperware container with a rock glued to the bottom of it. Excuse me. And I put that in the freezer for a day, and then it's ready to use. It's really easy. You take one of those and you put it in the bottom of the tank. You can even just take little flecks off of that, let them soak in the water, and then let them sink to the bottom of the tank. The main thing is that you want to make sure that all the babies are getting food. So a smaller container, a 5.5 gallon, is actually ideal for that for most species because the babies are itty bitty, itty bitty. So it's much easier to ensure that everyone's getting food in a smaller tank. If you have a 10 gallon, sometimes they can get lost, even if it's completely, bare bottom, no ornaments in it whatsoever. Even then, some of the babies can get lost. And, it's such a big tank that they can't find the food and they starve to death. So, like I said, it feeds at least twice a day, if not 3 times a day. And you will be cleaning this tank. I'm talking about maybe a 20% water change at least once a day, if not every other day, depending on your level of brood stock and stuff or your level of stock in the tank and stuff like that, and how much you're feeding and how much they're eating and how much they're pooping, all that stuff, and your filtration. I would again recommend just a sponge filter for a tank like that because babies are not strong enough to swim away from the suction on a cartridge filter or a canister filter. You could also do an undergravel filter, but I feel like that has too many nooks, crannies, and corners in it. It may be detrimental to the animals in the long run. So think about that. All right, final thing for babies is you will have morts. It doesn't matter if you do everything perfectly. Sometimes there are culls, sometimes there are morts. Don't let it get you down. And in fact, your first time breeding, you may have a lot of morts. Because there are certain things that even if it's explained to you perfectly, you don't really fully grasp until you get hands-on experience. So your first time, if you have a 50% mortality, I'd still say that's doing really good for your first time. That's a lot of babies that die, but at the same time, they generally have quite a few babies as it is. And once they start breeding, a lot of the times, once you get into that rhythm, you'll have lots and lots of babies. So your first batch may not go so well. It happens. Don't let it get you down. Even if you lose all your babies in your first batch, just, say, all right, so what went wrong? What can I do to make this better in the future? That's how a good breeder looks at it. It's not a complete loss. It is a gain of knowledge, rather. So think about that. Watch that. You will have dead babies. That's the only way to do it. I'm not going to sugarcoat it for you guys and say, oh, no, you can totally do it without any mortalities. Because even pros or even really experienced guys still lose babies from time to time. And in fact, my Medusa Plecos I have yet to have any viable offspring be produced from those breedings. I keep on losing babies, and actually I lose about 50% of my eggs every time too, and I'm not quite sure why. It's something that I'm still working on. So think about that. All right, and then a couple final things, branching out. So you bred your first Plecos, be it rubber nose, bristle nose, zebra Plecos. You bred zebra Plecos as your first Pleco because you're a prodigy or a genius or a magician or something like that, or a witch. What do you do next? Well, what I would recommend is to find another species. Once you feel like you have it down pat for one species, you feel like you've really accomplished it, you can do a variety of things. You can start up another tank and start breeding another species. You can add another species to the tank that's unintrusive and not going to outcompete. Or you can sell all of your brood stock that you have right now and start a completely different species. Trade them in, something like that. And I would recommend that you start, like, once you have an easy species under your belt, go to something a little bit harder. Go with something that needs different breeding requirements. Make this a learning experience for you and the people that are interacting with your tank. You know, you can use this as a teaching experience for people who know nothing about fish, for people who know a little bit about fish but nothing about Plecos, for people who have a community tank and didn't realize that you don't just have to buy common Plecos and once they get too big, sell them back to the fish store, or put them up on Craigslist so some guy can put it in his pond and have it die. These things are not, that's not the cycle that everyone needs to do. And in fact, some people may find that they actually really, really like Plecos, and that they don't really want to have a community tank. They want to have a Pleco-only tank or something crazy like that. That's actually the only wet system that I have running right now is a 20-gallon long that has 3 different species in it of Pleco and nothing else. So think about that. That's it. The world is your oyster at this point. If you breed a Pleco species and you say, well, that's really fun, but I want to try something else, there's other species out there that you can try. Banjo cats have been bred in captivity and can be bred in captivity. Corridorus have and can be bred in captivity. Think about all of that. If you see a family of fish and you say it'd be really fun to breed those are really unique, look into it. Plecos are a great place to start for a beginner who wants to breed fish, because they're not extremely difficult. A lot of species are available. A lot of captive bred specimens are available. We're talking like F12, F15, F55 generation CB captive bred. So look into it and see what's involved with the species that you're interested in breeding. Just a few final points. I really love Plecos. I think that they're awesome animals. Catfish in general are just really, really cool. But Plecos especially, they're so uniquely evolved into their niche, and they have speciated so much. It's amazing. They're such a beautiful animal. There's so many species, and there's quite a few genera, excuse me. They're probably all around one of my favorite fish altogether. So yeah, thanks for listening, guys. I'm sorry this video is so long. It'll be even longer once I add pictures, so brace yourself. Thanks if you stayed all the way through. If you want to hear about another group of animals or keeping something else, put it in the comment section below. I hope to hear from you guys soon. Thanks a lot.